Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got just a quick video for you with some more information on the Retroid Pocket Flip. Now I'm making this to address some of the points that people brought up in the comments of my review, and other ones that people just asked me about on Twitter or in other places, and I want to also talk about a few of the things that have changed since that review, or stuff that I've noticed after owning the Flip and using it now for about a month. So let's just get right into it. First up, I want to address a major problem that I've personally experienced and that I've subsequently seen other people talking about. And that problem is terrible battery life in standby mode once you close up the device and set it down. The Flip has a major problem here, folks. Pretty much every time I've charged this device fully, put it into standby mode and come back to it, say the next day, it's been completely dead. I'm talking 0%. Now, a few times it didn't quite die, but in instances where it should have been at like 95% because there was no usage, it was at maybe 20 or 15. Now, I checked the device to make sure that the screen was going off when the Flip closed, and you can see the screen through the opening there, so I can definitely confirm that the screen is powering off. I also checked out the typical Android power saver settings, and everything looked relatively normal there. So there's obviously a glaring problem somewhere in how this device handles standby. And you'll probably find a lot of advice if you're doing web searches right now, if you're a Flip owner, that'll tell you what settings to tweak on the Flip to improve its battery life in standby mode. And yeah, some of them can and will help. However, I have to say, in my personal experience, the thing that's made the biggest and most consistent improvement for me over my last week of testing has been just turning off Wi-Fi before I close up the system. For the most part, turning off Wi-Fi when the system is put into standby mode for me has dramatically increased its battery life during that time. So it still drained more than it should have for a modern Android device in standby mode, but instead of draining completely down to 0% overnight, when I've tested it with this, almost every time, it's been about between 93 and 95%. So it's only lost about 5 to 7% of its charge in the same amount of time. But I have to say, this doesn't fully resolve the problem. While it's been a lot better, I still did run into one or two circumstances over the last week where it drained way more than it should have again. But it is happening far less now with Wi-Fi off than it was before. So if you're experiencing this standby problem, my number one recommendation, turn off Wi-Fi when you're not using it. You can mess with the other energy saving settings also. You can pop into the battery saver section of the main Android settings and the power saving section of the handheld settings to tweak a few other things. But enough about that, let's move on and talk about performance and a few emulators. First up, let's talk about the 3DS emulator, Citra. There are updated versions of Citra available now that were not available when I did the review that use the Vulkan backend for video rendering. Now, as I record this video, you have to go to the Citra website and download the Canary builds, as these aren't in the mainstream version you'll find in Google Play yet. Now, it's just a matter of time before Vulkan support makes its way into the full official release, so who knows, it may already be in that version by the time you watch this. So what's changed in practical terms? Well, some games run a little better than they used to. On the flip side, no pun intended, some games that worked before don't run at all and just crash immediately. Other games, well, you might not notice too much difference. At this point, your mileage will vary depending on what game you want to run. Having said that, things are only going to get better now as the developers continue improving Vulkan support. So I expect pretty great things from Citra on Android in the future. Now let's talk about a few of the higher-end system emulators. Things like Aether SX2 and Dolphin. Some of you rightly brought up that other reviewers of the Retroid Pocket Flip seem to be getting better performance out of these emulators with the same games that I tested. And yeah, some of them did. And there's three major reasons for that I'll go into right now. The first big reason is that a lot of other reviewers are using the PAL versions of games. These were the versions that were available in Europe, which used the PAL video system, and those games ran at 50 Hz instead of 60 Hz, so they were naturally slower, making them slightly easier to emulate with the way that these newer generation emulators work. Personally, I'm not interested myself in playing the PAL versions, so I didn't cover them. For me, I don't want to play the games running more slowly than they did when I experienced them on the original NTSC systems when I played them when they were new. Now, if you're a gamer from a PAL region, you might be fine with the speed. Likewise, if you'd never played these games before, you might very well be okay with the slower PAL versions. For me though, PAL versions are just a definite no-go. Now, the second reason you may have seen some games run a smidge faster in other reviews, specifically GameCube titles, is that there are about 5 versions of Dolphin you can get that have subtle differences in performance and minor tweaks you can employ that are unique to specific emulator versions. Now, I mentioned that I tried several versions of Dolphin during my review, which was true, but you still might find a version I didn't test that runs one game or another slightly better than a different version. So while there's no catch-all solution when it comes to GameCube and Wii games, some games just will not run at full NTSC speed. You may find a few games that hit what most people would consider to be playable status in one specific version of Dolphin or another. So it is worth trying things out and seeing how they work in the different versions. And how will you know which one to use since there's so many to try? I'll get to that in just a moment. The third major reason you'll have seen some games running better than I showed you in my last video, namely stuff like Shadow of the Colossus on PS2, comes down to emulator settings, speed hacks, and tweaks. In fact, you can find several websites that have compatibility and suggested settings charts for running higher-end system games on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Retroid Pocket Flip, both of which use the same hardware. Now you'll see that sometimes these recommendations involve using PAL ISOs or ROMs, which, as I said, is a hard no for me. I'm providing a link to a pretty extensive recommendation spreadsheet which shows you which emulator to use, which version of the game to use, and what settings to tweak to get the maximum performance. Now, I do have a word of caution for those following these recommendations though. A lot of them are sound and will indeed get games running at more playable speeds. However, you'll also often be making sacrifices. These include lowering the resolution to below original hardware sometimes, disabling various visual effects, or enabling various speed hacks that will alter how a game looks or plays in some fashion. Now personally, I made changes to settings in several games that were running badly, and often found that the trade-offs just really weren't worth it, and I didn't want to play the games with these cuts in place. Like Shadow of the Colossus just looks a little too bland, for example. Now, the last thing I'm going to cover in this video was the question of input lag reduction. I was asked if you can enable run-ahead in RetroArch on the Retroid Pocket Flip, and if so, how did that affect performance? And this is one I probably should have really mentioned in the original video, so sorry I missed it there. I won't make that mistake again going forward. So to tackle the first question, yes, you can enable run-ahead in RetroArch on the Retroid Pocket Flip, and generally speaking, in games running on 16-bit hardware and below, you'll get full-speed performance. Even with run-ahead, there's still a little bit of control lag, but it is noticeably improved. However, you will not be able to use run-ahead at full speed with emulators for anything more complicated than, say, a Genesis, Super Nintendo, or some 16-bit arcade titles. Once we get into things like the 32X or PlayStation, performance with run-ahead enabled takes a major hit, and games become unplayable with slow speeds and severe audio skipping. Now there's another input lag reduction feature in RetroArch called preemptive frames, which has better performance in general than run-ahead. Now it wasn't available in any version of RetroArch I tested on the Flip, so I couldn't, try this option out for myself. I might do another quickie video on that in the future when I have a chance to actually test it on this device. Alright everybody, so if you have any other suggestions or things you'd like to see me cover on the Retroid Pocket Flip that I've got here, go ahead and let me know. If there's anything specific you want to see me test, any specific emulators, any specific games, I can't promise I'll get to everything if I get a lot of requests, but I'll definitely do what I can. So just hit me up in the comments and let me know what you're interested in seeing. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel for more retro gaming goodness. If you want to support the channel, you can now do that through channel memberships or as usual on Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.